Sign it, commie. Don't waste my time. Ronan Marchetti didn't raise his voice. He never had to, because when you're the most feared man on Chicago's north side, silence carries more weight than any threat. His steel-gray eyes watched her from across the oak desk in his private study. A room lined with oil paintings of dead men who'd built this empire with blood, where the faint smell of cigars and leather hung in the air like a warning, and 2 armed guards stood just outside the door. Because even a conversation about firing the help required witnesses in this world. Camille Reyes was 22, sitting in that Gold Coast mansion with trembling hands still inside her yellow cleaning gloves, wearing the same black uniform and white apron she'd worn every day for 3 years. 3 years of arriving before dawn and leaving after midnight. Of scrubbing blood stains off hallway tiles without asking questions. Of keeping secrets that could have destroyed powerful men if she'd ever opened her mouth. And she never did, not once, but none of that mattered now. A week ago, $50,000 vanished from the safe in this room, and the cameras caught only one person walking in during that window, her. Because the real thief knew every blind spot in a house he'd grown up in. Ronan sat across from her in his black 3-piece suit. No tie, PC Philippe catching the light. Laptop still open, as though ending someone's livelihood was just another line item between meetings. On the table lay her resignation letter, drafted by his lawyers, waiting for her signature. And hidden in her apron pocket was something he couldn't see. A pregnancy test with 2 red lines she discovered that morning. She was carrying his child. The result of one night 3 months ago when he'd come home with empty eyes and blood on his sleeves, and she was the only person still awake. One night that was never supposed to happen. One night he'd erased from memory by morning. She couldn't tell him. In his world, an unplanned child with the housekeeper wasn't a miracle. It was a vulnerability, something enemies would use, something that could get a little girl killed before she ever learned to walk. So Camille picked up the pen, her mind screamed, her heart hammered against her ribs, and inside her a new life had just begun to form. A life this man would never know about, she signed. Blue ink on white paper, and something invisible between them shattered. But what Ronan Marchetti didn't know was that this wasn't an ending. 6 years later, the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago would stand alone in the rain outside a Pilsen apartment, begging to see the daughter he never knew existed. And the woman who once cleaned his floors would be the one deciding whether to open the door. But before we get there, you need to hear what really happened. Because the truth behind that signature is far more dangerous than the lie that caused it. If this story already has your attention, hit like and share it with someone who needs to hear this, and subscribe now so you don't miss what comes next. Now, let's go back to the moment Camille walked out that door, because what she did in those final seconds changed everything. Camille rose slowly from the chair, her legs trembling. But she forced herself upright because she knew that if she collapsed now, she'd never get back up again. Ronan had already turned his attention back to the laptop screen, as if everything was finished, as if the 3 years she'd poured into this house had been folded into a single signature. And now, he could move on to the next item on his schedule. But Camille didn't walk out right away. She stopped in the middle of the room, her right hand touching the pocket of her apron, her fingers finding the small piece of plastic she'd hidden there all morning. She pulled it out, the pregnancy test with 2 red lines still clearly visible under the weak light slipping through the heavy curtains. She looked at it one last time, those 2 parallel red lines like 2 roads that would never meet. One the life she was living and one the life she should have been allowed to have. Then she snapped it in half. The crack of plastic sounded dry and sharp in the silent room. She broke it again into 3 pieces, then dropped them onto the edge of the heavy oak desk right in front of him before they scattered near the drawer. The sound of plastic tapping the bottom was so light, but to Camille, it weighed more than any sound she'd ever heard in her life. Ronan looked up, his gray eyes settled on her with cold curiosity, the kind of curiosity of a man used to controlling every detail of his territory. "What is that?" His voice carried no emotion, only an inventory-like question, the same tone he used when he asked his accountant about an unfamiliar expense. Camille didn't answer. For the first time in 3 years, she didn't lower her head to that voice. She turned back to face him, and in her brown eyes, heavy with tears, there was something Ronan had never seen in anyone. Not fear, not hatred, but a strange pity for the very man who was sending her away. "Thank you for giving me 3 years, Mr. Marchetti," she said, her voice shaking, but every word clear as if it had been weighed before it left her mouth. I hope you never wake up in the middle of the night because of a decision you made without ever having to hear the truth." The sentence hung in the cigar-thick air between them. Ronan didn't reply, not because he dismissed what she said, but because something in her voice left him without a single word to counter it. And for a man who'd never been short of language in any negotiation, that was so strange it felt irritating. Camille turned her back and walked to the door. Her gloved hand closed around the brass handle, cool beneath the rubber she hadn't had time to take off, and she pulled it open. 2 bodyguards stood in the hallway, glanced at her, then looked away. Because in this world, a housekeeper leaving wasn't the kind of thing anyone bothered to remember. The door closed behind her softly, not slammed, not dramatic, just a small click as the metal latch fit into the wooden frame. But that sound would echo in Ronan Marquette's memory years later at a frequency he'd never be able to explain. Ronan sat motionless for a few seconds after the door shut. He looked down at the agreement bearing her signature, the blue ink still slightly glossy, then glanced at the trash bin by the door. Something urged him to stand and look inside, but he didn't because Ronan Marchetti wasn't the kind of man who rummaged through a trash bin to understand a housekeeper's feelings. Or at least that's what he believed about himself. Instead, he stood and walked to the window. From the second floor of the mansion, through the thick bulletproof glass, he looked down at the front yard. Chicago rain hammered down in heavy sheets, turning the perfect green lawn into a dull gray mirror. And in the middle of that gray, Camille was walking toward the gate. She didn't run. She didn't bow her head. She didn't shield herself from the rain. She walked straight back along the stone path with steady steps, like someone who'd grown used to carrying things far heavier than rain. Her small figure blurred behind the dense downpour, past the iron fence, past the automatic gate opening to release her back into the world outside the Marchetti estate, the world she was about to face alone with a new life growing inside her. Ronan stood there until she disappeared completely. He didn't know why he stayed so long. He'd fired people before, cut off partners, made decisions 100 times colder without looking back. But this time there was something different, something in her last words and the way she looked at him with pity instead of hate, in the sound of cracking plastic he didn't understand. He returned to the desk, sat down, pulled the laptop closer, and forced himself back into numbers, calls, orders. Because that was how Ronan Marchetti handled anything he didn't want to feel. He worked until the feeling died. But that night, when the whole mansion sank into silence, and he lay alone in a bed too large for one person, Camille's words came back like an uninvited heartbeat. "I hope you never wake up in the middle of the night." He opened his eyes and stared at the ceiling in the dark. And for the first time, he wondered if he'd missed something he should have seen. But the question came and went, because Ronan Marchetti had never been a man who accepted he could be wrong. And 6 years had to pass before he finally understood that on that night, what he pushed out through the mansion gate wasn't just a woman in a rain-soaked uniform, but everything he didn't know he needed. That night, the Marchetti mansion was lit up like it was every other night. The private chef set dinner on a long table with enough space for 12 people. Yet only one plate sat at the head of it, the place Ronan always took, facing the blank wall on the other side, as if that emptiness was the only companion he would allow at his meals. He cut into the steak, lifted his wine, chewed slowly, everything precise, and controlled the way he ran every corner of the Marchetti empire. His phone vibrated in the middle of dinner. He picked it up without checking the caller's name, because in his position, only a handful of people were allowed to call at this hour, and every one of those calls meant money or trouble. Tommaso, his uncle, reported that a shipment had to move through the Southport before dawn. There was an issue with the transport crew, and they needed his decision. Ronan set the wine glass down, gave calm, clear instructions in under 2 minutes, then ended the call. No hesitation, no weighing options, no losing sleep over choices tied to hundreds of thousands of dollars and risks ordinary people would never dare to imagine. He returned to his meal, cut another piece of meat, and life kept turning around him perfectly, smoothly, coldly, as exact as a machine programmed to never stop for anyone. But when dinner ended, and he walked down the hallway toward his office, his feet paused at the door of the room Camille had walked out of just hours earlier. He didn't go in right away. He stood there for a few seconds, eyes dropping to the carpet where she had sat, and her last words rose again in his mind like an echo in an empty room. He drew a deep breath, pushed the door open, sat down, opened the laptop, and drowned everything in work. Because Ronan Marquetti believed any feeling that didn't serve a purpose was weakness. And in his world, weakness wasn't just useless, it was deadly. Meanwhile, nearly 15 mi southwest of the Gold Coast mansion, Camille stood at a bus stop on Ashland, soaked from head to toe. The rain wouldn't let up, and the wind off Lake Michigan cut sideways through the bus shelter where one corner of the glass was broken. She was still in her black uniform, still wearing the white apron now turned gray with rainwater. The yellow rubber gloves stuffed into the pocket of the thin coat she'd thrown on before leaving the mansion. The last CTA bus of the night arrived 10 minutes late, and in those 10 minutes, Camille stood alone under a flickering streetlight with one hand resting on her stomach. Not because of pain, but because of instinct, as if she were shielding the only thing left in this world that truly belonged to her. The bus came nearly empty. She sat in the back row by the window, her forehead against the cold glass, watching the city of Chicago slide past outside. The bright high-rises of downtown slowly gave way to lower buildings, older ones, darker ones, as the bus pushed farther south. Neon signs of late-night grocery stores, metal grates pulled tight over closed shops, graffiti murals on rain-soaked brick walls. This was Pilsen, the neighborhood Camille had called home since she was a child, where Spanish rang out on every corner, and the smell of sweet bread from familiar pinataras felt more familiar than any expensive perfume in the Marchetti mansion. She got off at the corner of 18th and hurried 2 blocks to the old apartment on the 3rd floor of a red brick building built back in the 1950s. The concrete stairs were damp and mildewed, the iron railing loose, the hallway light flickering like it was about to die. She let herself in with the spare key. Aunt Polar kept under the plant pot by the door. Inside, the small apartment was quiet. Aunt Polar was asleep, heavy breathing drifting from the bedroom in the back. The breathing of a 52-year-old woman whose diabetes had stolen almost all her strength. Camille didn't turn on the lights. She stepped into the small room her aunt let her use. A single bed, an old particle board dresser, a window looking out on the alley behind the building where stray cats sometimes cried at night. She sat on the edge of the bed, still wet, still cold, and pulled from her coat pocket the copy of the agreement she'd signed only hours earlier. She stared at her signature, the blue ink slightly smudged at the corner from tears. And for the first time since she'd walked out of that room, she let fear take her completely. Not fear of being poor, not fear of being alone, fear for the life inside her. She knew who Ronan Marchetti was. She knew how his world worked because she'd lived in it for 3 years, cleaning up the traces that world left behind. She knew that in that world, an illegitimate child of a mafia boss wasn't a blessing. It was a chess piece. Enemies would use the child as leverage. Allies would use the child to bargain. And Ronan himself, what would he do? Keep the baby? Hide the baby away? Turn the baby into another secret among the hundreds of secrets the Marquetti family buried beneath the foundations of their Gold Coast mansion? Camille folded the agreement, slid it into the nightstand drawer, and placed her hand on her stomach. Her belly was flat. No sign of anything on the outside, but inside that tiny heart was beating, and every beat was a reason for her to make the most important decision of her life. She wouldn't tell Ronan. Not because she hated him, not because she wanted revenge, because she wanted protection. She would disappear from everything connected to the name Marchetti. She would raise this child alone. In her world, the world of late-night buses, old apartments, small wages that were clean, a world where no one got shot for knowing too much, and no child had to grow up behind bulletproof glass. She lay down, pulled the thin blanket to her chest, and in the darkness of that small room in Pilsen, barely 15 miles from the Gold Coast mansion, yet as far as 2 different planets, Camille Reyes closed her eyes with a certainty she'd never had before. She would be stronger than fear. She had to be stronger because now she wasn't living only for herself anymore. In the weeks that followed, Camille knocked on door after door. She asked for work at a restaurant on 18th Street, and the manager looked at her stomach and shook his head without even letting her finish the sentence. The laundromat on the corner of Ashland said they already had enough people. The grocery store on Blue Island needed a night shift worker, but when she came back a second time in a loose shirt that could no longer hide her 4-month belly, they told her the position had been filled. Every time she was turned away, Camille swallowed her tears and moved on to the next door because she didn't have the right to stop, because inside her there was someone waiting for her not to give up. In the end, she found a job cleaning offices for a small company downtown. A shift from 10:00 at night to 4 in the morning, paid in cash every week, just enough to cover her share of the rent to Aunt Polar and buy basic food. But the CTA bus fare every day was something she couldn't afford if she wanted to save for the months after the baby came. So she walked 40 minutes each afternoon from Pilsen to downtown and 40 minutes back at dawn, her belly getting heavier by the day, the soles of her shoes wearing thinner, but her steps never slowing. Then Chicago winter arrived. Not the kind of cold people elsewhere could even imagine, but the kind that cut into skin and flesh, the kind where the wind off Lake Michigan sliced through every layer of clothing as if fabric didn't exist. One night in January, the temperature dropped to -15 degrees and Camille was walking home on Halstead when her legs stopped obeying her. Her vision blurred, her ears rang, her 6-month belly pulled her center forward, and she staggered, grabbed a street light pole, slid down, her back against the concrete. Snow seeping through her pants. She tried to call out to someone, but the street was empty at 3:00 in the morning, and her voice was so weak, her breath turned into white smoke and vanished instantly in the frozen air. She didn't know how long she sat there. Maybe 5 minutes, maybe 15. But when she heard footsteps and felt a warm hand settle on her shoulder, she thought she had to be dreaming. Father Miguel Cortez, the priest from St. Pius Church in Pilsen, was on his way back after visiting a parishioner who was seriously ill. He saw her curled up at the base of the streetlight, pregnant, lips purple, and he didn't ask a single question. He helped her up, draped his thick wool coat over her shoulders and guided her back to the church. He sat her by the heater in the common room, brought her a bowl of hot soup, and waited until color returned to her face. "You don't have to explain anything," he said in gentle Spanish. "You only have to know you're not alone." From that night on, Father Miguel became the spiritual anchor Camille never expected to find. He didn't give her much money because the church was poor, too. But he gave her food from the community pantry every week, gave her a warm place to sit and rest whenever Chicago was too cold for walking, and gave her what no one else could give her then, the faith that she was doing the right thing. Aunt Polar tried to help in her own way as well. Diabetes was making her weaker by the day, her legs swollen so she couldn't go far. But on evenings when Camille's nausea was so bad she couldn't lift her head from the pillow, Polar sat beside her, rubbing her back with trembling hands, telling old stories about Camille's mother, about how strong she'd been while carrying Camille alone in Puerto Rico before coming to Chicago, as if strength was something that ran in the blood of the women in this family. One afternoon, Camille passed a thrift store on 19th Street and saw a roll of creamy white yarn for $0.50. She stood outside the door for a few seconds, then went in and bought it. That night, sitting on the bed in her small room, she began to knit a tiny hat. She wasn't good at knitting, the stitches uneven, loose in places and tight in others. But she kept going slowly, patiently, and as she knit, she talked to her 7-month belly. "I promise you won't be short on love. The other things I'll find a way. But love, you'll have more than enough because I've got enough for both of us." That little hat was ugly, misshapen, but Camille made it with the last pennies she could spare, and with the only thing no one could take from her, hope. The first contraction hit at 2:00 in the morning on a night in November. When the Chicago wind was howling outside the apartment window in Pilsen, Camille knew it was time. She called an ambulance because there was no one to drive her. And while she waited, she tucked into her bag the misshapen, creamy white knit hat she'd been working on for the past 2 months, because it was the only thing she'd been able to prepare for the baby about to arrive. Aunt Polar woke at the sound of the ambulance siren, her swollen feet carrying her into the hallway, taking Camille's hand and saying she'd follow on the first bus. But Camille knew the last CTA had run hours ago, and the first one wouldn't come for a few more. She nodded, gave her aunt a steadying smile, then climbed into the ambulance alone. Strager Hospital at 3:00 in the morning was a world of cold white neon, steady beeping machines, and long hallways. Camille was pushed through on a gurney as pain tore through her in waves. The delivery ward was crowded because this was the largest public hospital in Chicago, and every night women came in to give birth, many of them alone just like her. A nurse named Rosa, a middle-aged Mexican woman with warm hands and a gentle voice, stayed by Camille's side through the whole labor. When the pain crested and Camille needed to hold someone's hand, not her mother's hand because she was gone, not the hand of the man who should have been here because he didn't know and he never would. She grabbed Rosa's hand, squeezing so hard her knuckles went white. And Rosa squeezed back as if it was the most ordinary thing in the world. Because for her, it was. Because at Strager Hospital, there were far too many mothers bringing life into the world with no one beside them but a nurse. Amelia was born at 5:47 in the morning. Her first cry cut through the room like a declaration that she had arrived, that she was alive, that she was here in spite of everything. The nurse laid Amelia on Camille's chest, and in that moment, the world stopped turning. Camille looked down at the tiny baby resting against her. Wet black hair plastered to her scalp, skin flushed pink and red, little fists clenched as if she were holding on to something invisible. And then Amelia opened her eyes. Gray-green eyes, not brown like Camille's, not dark like Aunt Polar or anyone else in the Ray's family. Gray-green, clear and deep. Ronan Marchetti's eyes looking up at her from the small face of her daughter. Camille cried, not from sadness, not from fear. She cried because she understood that no matter how far she ran, no matter how completely she erased the name Marchetti from her life, those eyes would remind her every day of the man she'd chosen not to tell. She held Amelia tighter, pressed her lips to her baby's forehead, and whispered in a voice meant only for the two of them to hear. "You're mine, only mine." A few hours later, when Aunt Polar finally made it to the hospital with re-end eyes and ragged breath from having to walk part of the way from the bus stop, an administrative staff member brought the birth certificate form for Camille to fill out. She wrote each line in blue ballpoint, her hands still shaking from exhaustion. The child's name, Amelia Reyes, date of birth, place of birth, mother's name, Camille Reyes. Then she reached the line for father. A blank box. The tip of her pen hovered over the paper, and she stared at that empty line for a long time. Not because she didn't know what to write, but because she knew exactly which name belonged there, and she was choosing to leave it empty. She drew a breath, skipped the line, and signed her name under mother. A signature carrying the weight of both roles she had just claimed. Then she handed the paper back to the staff member without looking back even once. 6 years can fly by on a calendar. But when every day is a battle, 6 years can feel like an entire lifetime. In the first months after Amelia was born, Camille held her baby in one arm and scrubbed office floors with the other, figuratively, but in truth, it wasn't much different. At night, she still cleaned downtown, leaving Amelia with Aunt Polar in their small apartment in Pilsen. During the day when Amelia napped, Camille went to the Pilsen Community Center to enroll in a free business management course for low-income women. She sat among other immigrant women, many of them not fluent in English, many of them bringing small children into the classroom, and she learned how to keep books, how to calculate taxes, how to register a small business in the state of Illinois. She wasn't the best student, but she was the one who never missed a day. After 3 years of working for other people, when Amelia started preschool and Camille had built up both experience and a small nest egg from living so frugally, she spent almost nothing beyond rent and food. She registered Olympia Services, her own cleaning company. Her first 2 clients were a dental office and a small accounting firm, both in Pilsen. Both willing to trust her because they'd watched how she worked for the past 3 years. Camille didn't promise anything grand. She only promised she'd clean well and do it right, and she kept that promise. Slowly, one client referred another. Within a year, she hired her first employee, a Guatemalan single mother named Maria she'd met at the community center. Then another, then another. By the time Amelia was 5, Olympia Services had 8 employees. All single mothers or immigrants like her, women other places, had turned away. But Camille chose to give a chance. She didn't pay the highest wages on the market, but she paid on time. She bought insurance for each woman when she could afford it, and she never looked down on anyone because she knew exactly what that feeling did to a person. Amelia grew up in that apartment, small but clean, walls covered with butterfly pictures Camille cut from old magazines, a twin bed pushed against the wall with the misshapen creamy white knit hat sitting on the nightstand like a keepsake. Aunt Polar, though her health kept weakening, still welcomed Amelia every afternoon when Camille went to work, teaching her to cook rice in Spanish and telling her stories about Puerto Rico. Amelia spoke both languages before she started first grade, and she had gray-green eyes no one in Pilsen could explain. Eyes that didn't match anyone in the Reyes family. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, 6 years for Ronan Marchetti meant 6 years of expanding an empire. Marchetti Holdings took over 3 more major real estate projects along the Chicago River, growing the legitimate network that shielded the illegal operations underneath. His name appeared in business magazines with the title of successful entrepreneur. But in the underworld, everyone understood the real weight behind that name. He married 2 years after Camille left and arranged marriage to the daughter of an allied family back east. The kind of political alliance the Mafia world called securing territory. The marriage lasted 2 years, then ended in divorce papers and a large settlement because his wife said she couldn't live with a man who didn't let go of vigilance even in his sleep. After that came a few more relationships, none lasting more than a few months. Every woman said the same thing before she walked away. You don't know how to trust anyone. Ronan didn't argue because he knew they were right. But he didn't change either because, in his world, trusting people wasn't a virtue. It was a risk. The Gold Coast mansion was still lit up every night, still impeccable, still perfect down to the last detail, but it was getting quieter. Dinner was still one plate at the head of the table. The living room still held no laughter, and sometimes late at night when he sat alone in his office with a half-empty glass of whiskey and the laptop screen casting blue light over his face. The memory of that afternoon returned. Not all of it, just one moment. Camille's eyes when she stood at the door and said goodbye. He'd seen eyes his whole life. Eyes filled with fear, with hatred, with pleading. But those eyes weren't any kind he recognized. They weren't the eyes of someone guilty. They were the eyes of disappointment. A deep disappointment reserved for someone she'd once believed could be better than this. And strangely, that haunted Ronan Marchetti more than any enemy circling his territory, because enemies were something he knew how to handle. But the disappointment in the eyes of a woman he'd sent away was something he didn't know what to do with. The change didn't begin with conscience. It began with the FBI. 6 years after Camille left, federal investigators increased pressure on the money laundering trail, running through Marchetti Holdings' real estate system. 2 subpoenas arrived in the same week. Federal attorneys started calling in witnesses, and an intermediary account in the Cayman Islands was frozen without warning. Ronan understood that if he wanted the empire to stay standing, he needed to know exactly where every dollar had gone over the past 10 years. Not so he could confess honestly to the FBI, but so he could see what needed to be buried deeper and what could be sacrificed. He called Yolna Vilov, his personal attorney and right hand in finance, and ordered a full internal audit from top to bottom. Yolna spent 3 weeks digging through thousands of transactions, and what she found wasn't what Ronan expected. A pattern of unusual cash withdrawals stretching across years, each one small enough to avoid triggering automatic alerts, but together totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars. All of it traced back to a single person with access to the family's internal financial system besides Ronan himself, Johnny Marchetti. Yolna placed the report on Ronan's desk late one night, looked him straight in the eye, and said, $50,006 years ago wasn't the only time. It was just the first time. Ronan read line by line. Numbers didn't lie. Johnny had siphoned money from a secondary safe, from operating accounts, from the black fund set aside for underground work. All to pay off gambling debts to a loan shark organization tied to the Volkov Syndicate, an Eastern European mafia network competing with the Marchetti family for territory on the south side of Chicago. His brother hadn't just stolen from the family. He'd indirectly financed an enemy. Ronan closed the report, stayed silent for a long time, then said only 2 words to Yolna. Bring him. Johnny showed up at the Gold Coast mansion at 10 that night, unaware of anything, still smiling as he walked in the way he always did when he visited his brother. But instead of being led to the living room, 2 bodyguards took him down to the basement. The Marchetti mansion basement wasn't for wine. Bare concrete walls, cold white lights, a steel table, and 2 chairs. This was where the Marchetti family handled problems that never appeared on paper. Ronan was already seated there, Yolna's report open on the table. When Johnny saw the numbers, his smile died. Brother, let me explain. Sit down. Ronan's voice wasn't loud, but Johnny sat immediately because he knew that voice, the voice Ronan used before things happened that couldn't be undone. Ronan didn't ask much. He slid the report across the table and waited. Johnny tried to deny it for the first 5 minutes, then explained for the next 10, and when Ronan still didn't speak, only watched him with gray eyes as cold as the concrete under their feet, Johnny broke. He confessed to everything. Gambling debts since he was 25, nights of losing everything at underground tables, loan sharks threatening to break his fingers one by one if he didn't pay, and desperation leading him to his brother's safe. Ronan listened, drew a slow breath, then asked the final question. 6 years ago, did she take the money? Silence. Johnny lowered his head. No, you knew from the start. She was just a housekeeper, Johnny said without daring to look up. Who would believe her? I thought you'd never find out and it would all pass. The concrete room was so quiet they could hear water dripping from a pipe in the ceiling. Ronan looked at his brother, the man who shared his blood. His name, who'd grown up in this house with him. And he saw the thing he hated most in the world. His father, old man Marchetti, had been like that, too. Using the powerless as sacrifices for his own mistakes, punishing the ones with no ability to fight back in order to protect the ones closest to him. Ronan had sworn he'd never become him. But 6 years ago, he had done exactly that without even realizing it. He had thrown out an innocent woman without investigating, without listening, without giving her even one chance to tell the truth, just because she was the weakest person in the room. And in his world, the weakest always carried the blame. Ronan stood, looked down at Johnny one last time. You've got 24 hours to disappear from Chicago. Every account, every card, every access point connected to the family is cut off immediately. You're not a Marchetti anymore. Johnny opened his mouth to say something, then met his brother's eyes and stopped, because he understood that Ronan letting him walk out of that basement on his own 2 legs was the last mercy he would ever receive. When Johnny left, Ronan stayed behind alone in the cold concrete basement. And for the first time in 6 years, Camille Reyes's face didn't come back in his memory as a blurred image. It came back clear, sharp, painful, along with the understanding that he owed her something no amount of money could repay. After Johnny left the basement, Ronan didn't go up to his bedroom. He went back to his office on the 2nd floor. He needed to be alone with the truth that had just been exposed. Needed to sit in the very room where 6 years ago he'd forced an innocent woman to sign the sentence she didn't deserve. He sat in his chair, didn't turn on the laptop, didn't pour a drink, just sat in the dark while street lights spilled through the window and laid long bands of light across the wooden floor. Then he started cleaning. Not because the room needed it, but because he needed to do something with his hands so his mind wouldn't explode. He pulled open the desk drawer, flipped through old papers, expired contracts, business cards he no longer used. And when he yanked the drawer all the way out and lifted it to set it aside, something small fell from a narrow gap between the drawer's bottom and the desk frame, where it had been wedged for years. Ronan picked it up, a small piece of white plastic about 1.5 inches long, its surface slightly yellowed by time. He almost tossed it, but under the street light coming through the window, he saw a faint pink line running across the plastic. His hand froze. A flash from 6 years ago sparked in his mind, not sharp but clear enough to remember. Camille standing by the door, pulling something from her apron pocket, looking at it, then snapping it. The dry crack of plastic in a silent room. He'd asked, "What is that?" And she hadn't answered. Back then, he hadn't cared enough to ask again. Now he held the plastic between 2 fingers, and for the first time he cared. He opened his phone and searched images of pregnancy tests. The screen filled with results. White plastic sticks with small windows showing 1 or 2 pink lines. He looked at the piece in his hand, then back at the screen. The pink line, the same kind of plastic, the same size. His heart started beating harder. Not the kind of beat he felt when facing danger, but the kind that came when the ground under him began to shift, and everything he thought he knew suddenly turned uncertain. She was pregnant that day. The thought slammed into him with a weight he wasn't prepared to catch. He set the plastic on the desk, picked up his phone, and called Yolna. It was nearly 1:00 in the morning, but Yolna answered on the second ring because when Ronan Marchetti called at 1:00 in the morning, it wasn't a call that could wait until daylight. "I need you to find someone," he said. "Camille Reyes. She worked here 6 years ago. Find everything about her over the last 6 years, where she lives, her work, her family, everything, and don't let her know." Yolna didn't ask why because she never asked why. She only asked for a deadline. 2 days. Ronan said, then hung up. Yolna finished in 1.5 days. The report was on Ronan's desk the next afternoon, neat, detailed, coldly precise, like every report Yolna had ever produced. Camille Reyes, 28 years old, residing in Pilsen, Chicago, owner of Olympia Services, an industrial cleaning company legally registered in the state of Illinois, 8 employees. 1 daughter named Amelia Reyes, 5 years old, enrolled at Orozco Academy, a public elementary school in Pilsen. The birth certificate listed father as blank. Ronan read that line twice, 5 years old. She'd been pregnant 6 years ago, a 5-year-old child. The numbers locked together with ruthless clarity. He turned the next page and stopped. Yolna had attached a photo pulled from Olympia Services' social media taken on the company's family day. Camille stood in the middle of her employees, smiling, and beside her was a little girl in a floral dress. Thick black hair, a small chin, and gray-green eyes staring straight into the camera without the slightest shyness. Ronan stared at the photo, and the world stopped. Those eyes, he knew those eyes because he saw them every morning in the mirror. That face, that chin, the way the child looked straight at the lens without fear. It was exactly the way he looked into anyone's eyes without flinching. He set the report down, stood, and stepped out onto the balcony. Chicago spread beneath him, millions of lights glittering in the night. And somewhere in that vast city, in a small apartment in Pilsen, there was a 5-year-old child with his eyes sleeping without knowing who her father was. Ronan gripped the balcony railing with both hands. And for the first time in his life, those hands that had signed orders to deal with problems most people never dared to imagine. Hands that had never trembled in front of any enemy began to shake. Ronan hadn't even decided what to do next when fate arranged it for him. 2 weeks after the night, he stood on the balcony staring down at Chicago with trembling hands. Benny Tran, the building manager of Marquetti Holdings' 18-story office tower in River North, submitted a new cleaning contract to the administration department. The winning bidder was Olympia Services, the most competitive price among 4 vendors, the highest ratings from previous clients, clean legal records. Benny didn't know the connection between the company owner and his own boss because to him, it was just a routine operational decision. Choose the best contractor for the lowest cost. The contract was signed, and the name Camille Reyes appeared on internal Marquetti Holdings paperwork before Ronan ever had the chance to see it. Camille found out before Ronan did. On the first day, she came to the River North building to survey the space before bringing her team in. She walked through the glass doors of the main lobby and saw the name on the brass plaque mounted on the marble wall, Marquetti Holdings. Her steps stopped. 6 years she'd built a life far from that name. And now it was right in front of her, engraved in brass, polished, bright, impossible to ignore. Her first instinct was to cancel the contract, turn back to Pilsen, call Benny Tran, and say she was withdrawing, find another contract, any contract not tied to the Marquetti name. But then she thought of the 8 employees waiting for her to bring them work. This was her biggest contract yet, big enough to hire 5 more people, big enough to finally buy health insurance for the entire crew. The one thing she'd promised them from the beginning, but had never had the money to deliver. She stood in the lobby staring at the name on the wall, then drew a deep breath. She wasn't the 22-year-old girl trembling in yellow rubber gloves anymore. She was a business owner. She had a legitimate contract, and she wasn't going to let fear make decisions for her ever again. She kept the contract. For the first 2 weeks, everything went normally. Camille's crew worked late evenings and nights after office hours, so the chances of running into Ronan were close to 0. Camille came to supervise once a week in the afternoon, checked quality, signed papers with Benny Tran, then left before the top floor where Ronan worked could even know she'd been in the building. She thought she could keep that distance forever. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon of the 3rd week, the fire sprinkler system on the 9th floor malfunctioned and triggered the alarm for the whole building. Red lights flashed. The loudspeakers blared evacuation announcements, and more than 300 people started flooding the stairwells because the elevators automatically locked under safety protocol. Camille was on the 12th floor checking an area that had just been cleaned. Ronan was on the 15th floor in a meeting with Yolna. Both of them came down through the emergency stairs with the flow of people. And between the 10th and 9th floors, the line jammed for a few seconds because an exit door was stuck. Camille turned and looked up, and Ronan was looking down. 6 years compressed into a single second. She recognized him immediately. Still tall, still those cold gray eyes, still the black suit like the last time she'd seen him, but now there were faint wrinkles at the corners of his eyes and a thin streak of silver at his temple that hadn't been there 6 years ago. He recognized her too, but not the girl he remembered. Camille stood in front of him in a white stand collar blouse and slacks, her hair pinned into a neat bun, an ID badge on her chest that read Olympia Services, and beneath the company name, one word, owner. Her back was straight. Her eyes didn't lower. She wasn't the housekeeper in a black uniform anymore, and they both knew it. Camille, he said, and she'd never heard that tone from him before. Not commanding, not cold, almost stunned. Mr. Marquetti, she replied, polite, calm, properly distant, then turned and kept moving down the stairs with the crowd when the whole building gathered in the lobby, waiting for technicians to confirm it was safe. Ronan stood near the glass doors, looking out at the street. But his eyes weren't on the street. His eyes were on the left corner of the lobby, where a little girl with black hair was sitting on a waiting chair next to one of Camille's employees, her legs swinging above the floor, a pencil in her hand as she drew in a small notebook. School was closed today and Camille had no one to watch her daughter, so Amelia had come with her. The child looked up as if she could feel someone watching, and those gray-green eyes met Ronan's gray eyes across the crowded lobby. Amelia wasn't afraid, wasn't shy. She only looked at him with the pure curiosity of a 5-year-old, then lowered her gaze and went back to drawing. But Ronan couldn't lower his gaze and go back to anything. He stood there in the lobby of his own building, surrounded by hundreds of employees, and felt as if someone had pulled all the air out of his lungs. Because that child didn't just have eyes like his. She was his miniature copy. And now he knew the photo online hadn't lied. The numbers hadn't been wrong. The piece of plastic in the drawer had been real. And the truth was sitting 10 steps away, drawing with a pencil in a small notebook, completely unaware that the man staring at her with his hands clenched at his sides was her biological father. 2 days after the encounter in the evacuation stairwell, Camille received a call from Ronan's assistant, inviting her to a meeting to review the cleaning services contract in the private office on the top floor of the River North building. It was a reasonable explanation, standard procedure, but Camille knew immediately it wasn't about the contract. She accepted because she wasn't running anymore. That afternoon, she came to the building in a navy blazer, hair and a low bun, no jewelry, nothing unnecessary. The elevator carried her to the highest floor, and when the doors opened, she saw a wide hallway paved in gray stone, floor-to-ceiling glass walls, revealing the entire Chicago skyline, the Chicago River curling below like a silver streak between forests of skyscrapers. The assistant led her into a private conference room, then closed the door. Ronan was already there. No suit today, only a black shirt with the sleeves rolled up. And it was a small detail Camille noticed instantly because Ronan Marquetti always wore a suit like armor. And the fact that he'd taken it off meant he was trying to appear less threatening. And the intention itself told her this conversation would go far beyond a cleaning contract. For the first 15 minutes they talked about work. Ronan asked about service quality, supervision frequency, control procedures. Camille answered precisely. Professionally, no more and no less. She'd run Olympia services long enough to know how to sit across from power without shaking, and Ronan noticed she wasn't the woman he remembered. Then he set his pen on the table, went quiet for a few seconds, and when he spoke again, his voice changed completely. No longer the voice of a CEO evaluating a vendor. 6 years ago, the day you left my house, you were pregnant. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Camille didn't flinch, didn't turn pale. Didn't give him any dramatic reaction he might have been expecting. She held his gaze and stayed silent long enough for him to understand she was choosing her words, not panicking for an answer. The truth didn't matter to you 6 years ago, Mr. Marquetti. Why does it matter now? The sentence hit Ronan like a punch he couldn't deflect. Not because she was wrong, but because she was so right. He had nothing to argue with. 6 years ago, he hadn't wanted to hear it. Hadn't needed to hear it. Hadn't given her even one chance to speak. He drew a breath and did something he'd almost never done in 37 years of living. Not in front of anyone. I was wrong. 3 words, shorter than any order he'd ever given, but heavier than all of them. Camille didn't react outwardly. But inside her, something shifted because it was the first time she'd ever heard this man admit fault, and she knew that with his nature, those 3 words were harder than any life or death negotiation in the underworld. I know about Gianni, he went on. I know the money wasn't you. I know everything and I know it too late. Camille said nothing. She waited because she knew he wasn't finished. Ronan leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. But there's something you need to understand, Camille. If that child carries Marquetti blood, whether you want it or not, whether you hide her for as long as you can, she's in danger you can't see. I have enemies more than you think, and they don't spare family. Camille felt the blood in her body turn cold. For 6 years, she'd run from the Marquetti name for exactly this reason, because she knew how dangerous that world was. Because she'd scrubbed blood off hallway tiles and understood violence wasn't an exception in that world. It was the rule. But she also realized what 6 years of hiding hadn't changed. Blood didn't disappear because she wanted it to. Amelia's gray-green eyes would always be there, and if someone was curious enough to look closely, the connection would surface whether the birth certificate left father blank or not. Amelia isn't a chess piece, she said, her voice steady, but her hands clenched beneath the table. She isn't property. She isn't a weakness. She isn't a target. She's my daughter. Is she also my daughter? The question hung between them, between the glass room overlooking Chicago, between 6 years of silence. Camille looked at him for a long time. There was no hatred in her eyes, no weakness, only the truth she'd carried alone for 6 years, and now it was too heavy to carry alone any longer. Yes, she said. Amelia is yours. The room went silent. The Chicago skyline glittered behind the glass as if the outside world had no idea that inside this room, a truth just spoken had changed the lives of 3 people forever. Ronan drove back to the Gold Coast mansion in silence. No radio, no calls, no orders given to anyone. For the first time in years, he drove himself instead of using a driver because he didn't want anyone to see his face right now. He parked in the garage, walked through the dark hallway without turning on a light, went straight into his office and closed the door. He sat in the familiar chair, poured a glass of whiskey from the Macallan bottle on the shelf, set the glass on the desk, then didn't touch it. His right hand opened the drawer, took out the yellowed piece of the pregnancy test, and placed it beside the phone screen showing the photo of Amelia that Yolna had found. The plastic fragment and the photo sat next to each other on the oak desktop. One proof of a truth he'd ignored 6 years ago, and one the consequence of that truth. A 5-year-old child with his eyes and her mother's smile. He stared at the photo and began to count. 5 birthdays he wasn't there for. 5 Christmas mornings she woke up and he wasn't the one leaving gifts under the tree. Her first step, he didn't see it. Her first word, he didn't hear it. Her first day of school, he wasn't standing at the gate. The nights she had a fever, he didn't stay awake. The times she fell, he didn't catch her. 5 years, day by day, moment by moment, all of it passing without him even knowing it existed. And now it piled up in front of him like a sentence no lawyer could lessen. He looked at the piece of plastic. He remembered the sound of it snapping in this office 6 years ago. Back then, he'd asked, "What is that?" in a careless voice. Then turned back to his laptop. If he'd stood up, picked up the pieces, looked closely, asked one more question, just one, everything would have been different. But he didn't because he was Ronan Marchetti, the man who controlled everything except the ability to listen when it mattered most. He sat in the dark, street lights spilling through the window and drawing a pale stripe across the untouched whiskey glass. And he felt something rise in his chest, hot, heavy, unfamiliar. He didn't recognize it at first, because it was a feeling he'd buried deep since childhood, since his father taught him tears were for the weak, and the weak didn't exist in the Marchetti family. But tonight, no one was watching. No enemies, no allies, no bodyguards, only him and the photo of a 5-year-old daughter who'd never known who her father was. A tear rolled down his right cheek. He wiped it away immediately with the back of his hand. Fast, decisive, the reflex of a man trained to hide every sign of weakness. But that tear was real, and he knew it was real. 15 miles away in the apartment in Pilsen, Camille sat on the edge of Amelia's bed, watching her sleep. The child lay on her side, arms wrapped around an old teddy bear. Black hair spread across the pillow, breathing soft and even. The small room was so peaceful, Camille could hear the ceiling fan turning slowly and the cry of stray cats in the alley. She had built this piece over 6 years with sweat, with tears, with nights walking 40 minutes through snow. Amelia had friends, a school, Aunt Polar, a steady routine, everything a child needed except a father. And now that father knew she existed. Camille was afraid. Not afraid Ronan would hurt Amelia, but afraid his power would crush the small world she had built. His lawyers were better than anyone she could afford. His money was more than everything she could earn in a lifetime. If he wanted custody, she wouldn't stand a chance in court. But then she looked at Amelia and remembered the question her daughter asked every year on Father's Day when school had them make cards for their dads. "Mom, who do I give mine to?" Every time she heard it, her heart twisted. And every time she said, "Make one for Aunt Pearl." Then turned away so Amelia wouldn't see her eyes go red. Amelia had a right to know who her father was. Camille knew that even though it went against every protective instinct inside her, she bent down, kissed Amelia's forehead, then stepped into the living room and sat alone in the dark. The same way Ronan was sitting alone in the dark on the other side of the city, two people torn between past and future, between fear and responsibility, between pride and a truth they both knew couldn't be buried any longer. 3 days after that longest night, Ronan called Camille. He was direct, no circling, saying he wanted a DNA test, not because he doubted her word, but because he needed a legal foundation before stepping into Amelia's life in any form. "I don't want to arrive with words," he said. "I want to arrive with responsibility, and responsibility needs paperwork." Camille stayed quiet for a few seconds on the phone. She had nothing to hide, and she also understood that in the American legal world, a DNA test was the first step to establishing lawful paternity, something she feared but had no right to deny her daughter. "Okay," she said, "but on my terms. The lab is my choice, not yours." Ronan agreed without hesitation. The test was done at a private lab in Lakeview that Camille found online, neutral, not connected to anything carrying the Marquetti name. Amelia's cheek cells were collected with a swab, and she thought it was just a normal health check and didn't ask anything else. The results took 2 weeks. Those 2 weeks were the longest for both of them for different reasons. Camille lived through them in a half-normal, half-waiting state. Mornings taking Amelia to school, afternoons supervising contracts, evenings cooking and reading stories to her daughter. Everything still the same. But under that stable surface was the awareness that their life was about to change, and she couldn't control which direction it would take. Ronan used those 2 weeks to learn about Amelia. Not in an invasive way, but through the traces she left in the world that anyone could see. The Arasco Academy website posted photos of students and activities. Amelia appeared in a class math competition photo, standing in the front row with a paper medal on her chest. In another photo, she stood in the schoolyard beside a smaller boy, one hand on his shoulder in a protective stance, the caption saying, "Amelia Reyes had been praised by her teacher for helping a new student fit into the class." Ronan stared at that photo for a long time. His daughter protected someone weaker, the complete opposite of what he'd done 6 years ago. But the detail that truly sent a chill through him came from a small post on the Pilsen Community Center website, where they'd held a career day for children. Each child was asked what they wanted to be when they grew up. Next to the name Amelia Reyes, age 5, the answer was written down word for word. "I want to build a house nobody can break." Ronan read it, then read it again. Marquetti Holdings, the empire his grandfather built, his father expanded, and he now ran, was built at its core on building, on real estate, on raising structures of concrete and steel. And a child who'd never known who her father was, who'd never set foot in any building with the Marquetti name, wanted to build houses. Blood didn't need a birth certificate to flow. It found its own way. The test results arrived on a Thursday morning through a secure email sent to both parties. Ronan opened the file in his office, 1 page, cold scientific language, statistical figures, and on the conclusion line, probability of paternity, 99.9%. He'd known the result already. Those gray-green eyes had told him the first day he saw Amelia in the building lobby. But knowing and seeing it printed in black and white weren't the same, because black and white turned what he suspected into what he had to take responsibility for. And the page trembled in his hand, not from surprise, but from the weight of 6 years of absence, now officially dropping onto his shoulders as an undeniable 99.9%. After the test results were confirmed, Ronan called Camille and said he wanted to meet Amelia. Camille set conditions immediately. Public place, no bodyguards, no one to know besides the 3 of them, and she would introduce him as her mother's friend and nothing more. Ronan agreed to everything without negotiating because he understood this wasn't a deal he had the right to demand. They chose Millennium Park on Saturday afternoon. Ronan arrived 30 minutes early. He parked 2 blocks from the park and walked in. No suit, only a black Henley and dark pants. No PC Philippe because he took it off and left it in the car. And for the first time in years, he went somewhere without a single guard behind him. He sat on a stone bench near Cloud Gate, watching children run around the giant steel bean, hearing their laughter bounce against the Chicago afternoon sky, and realized this was the first time he'd sat in a public place alone among ordinary people without thinking about who was watching, who was a threat, who needed his attention. He cleared his throat, only thought about a 5-year-old girl who was about to arrive, and he didn't know what he was supposed to say to her. He had stood in front of a federal judge without shaking. He had stared down a rival Mafia boss without blinking, but the thought of having to talk to his 5-year-old daughter made his palms sweat. Then he saw them. Clear's throat Camille came in from Michigan Avenue, holding the hand of a little girl in a red coat, black hair tied into a ponytail, moving with quick, lively steps. Amelia looked around the park with wide gray-green eyes, curious as if everything was interesting. Ronan stood when they got close, his heart hammered so hard he could hear it in his ears. Camille stopped in front of him and said in a gentle, normal voice, "Amelia, this is Ronan, Mom's friend." Amelia lifted her face to look up. She had to tilt her head back because Ronan was so much taller than her. Gray-green eyes met gray eyes, and Ronan felt as if someone had touched the deepest place inside him, the place he thought he'd locked away a long time ago. "Hi, sir," Amelia said in a clear voice. Not afraid, not shy, only polite in the way a well-taught child greets an adult. "Hi, Amelia," Ronan answered, and he had to force his voice to stay steady because his throat tightened. The three of them sat on the stone bench. Camille stayed in the middle at first, but Amelia quickly moved to sit beside Ronan because she wanted to ask him about the big steel beam in the distance. Ronan explained it was Cloudgate, and she nodded, then asked about school, talked about her best friend Lucia, about the painting she'd made last week in art class, a tall building with lots of windows. Ronan listened, truly listened. Not the kind of listening that waited for a chance to respond, but the kind that listened because every word from this child's mouth was precious. "What do you do?" Amelia asked suddenly. "I build houses," Ronan said, reducing the Marquetti Holdings empire to 3 words a 5-year-old could understand. "Big houses or small?" she asked. "Both." Amelia tilted her head and thought for a moment. "I like smaller houses better. Smaller houses feel warmer." Camille looked away because she didn't want anyone to see her eyes getting wet. Amelia's words weren't aimed at anyone, but they cut through every layer of wealth Ronan owned because his Gold Coast mansion was big and it had never been warm. After that, Camille bought Amelia ice cream from a nearby cart. The little girl chose chocolate, took 2 licks, then got a brown smudge right on the tip of her nose. Amelia crossed her eyes to look at her own nose and burst out laughing, a bright, crisp laugh in the afternoon air. Ronan watched her laugh, and he laughed too, not the social smile he wore at parties. Not the cold smile he used in negotiations, but a real smile that started in his eyes before it reached his mouth. The kind of smile he couldn't remember the last time he'd worn. Camille saw that smile, and something inside her shifted, small, quiet, like a door opening another millimeter, and she wasn't sure whether she wanted it to open or close. Less than a week after the meeting at Millennium Park, the ghost of the past returned. Gianni Marchetti didn't disappear the way Ronan thought he would. After being cast out of the family, stripped of every account, every access point, every layer of protection the Marchetti name provided, Gianni drifted down to the south side. With his old debts still intact, and his resentment sinking deeper by the day, he reached out to the Vilov Syndicate, the very Eastern European Mafia organization he'd once owed gambling money to, and offered a simple deal, internal Marchetti information, in exchange for protection and cash. Gianni knew the security layout of the Gold Coast mansion, knew Ronan's schedule, knew the name of every guard, knew the weak spots in the financial system, and he was willing to sell it all. But the most valuable information Gianni had wasn't in ledgers or security diagrams. In the weeks after he was exiled, before Ronan could sever every channel completely, Gianni still had an old contact on the security team who texted him from time to time. From those scraps of messages, Gianni learned that Ronan had recently been going somewhere every Saturday without bodyguards, something that had never happened. Gianni followed out of curiosity and discovered Ronan sitting in Millennium Park with a woman and a little girl. The little girl had gray-green eyes that matched Ronan's perfectly. Gianni didn't need a DNA test to understand what he was looking at. The call came to Ronan's phone at 11:00 at night on a weekday. Ronan recognized his brother's voice immediately. "I thought you said I wasn't a Marchetti anymore," Gianni said, his tone bitter and triumphant at the same time. "But turns out you've got something you don't want anyone to know. A little daughter in Pilsen, eyes just like yours. It would be a shame if someone found out she exists, wouldn't it, brother?" Ronan said nothing for 3 seconds. Those 3 seconds felt like a lifetime, because in those 3 seconds, he realized Amelia wasn't only his daughter. She'd just become a target. Exactly what Camille had feared 6 years ago. Exactly why she'd hidden her child from him. And now that fear had become real, he ended the call. Immediately called his security team, ordered 2 men to watch the apartment in Pilsen from now until further notice. Then he drove to Pilsen close to midnight. He parked in front of the red brick building where Camille lived and stepped onto the staircase to the third floor for the first time. Cracked concrete, a shaky iron railing, a hallway light flickering, peeling paint exposing old brick beneath. Ronan looked around and felt shame cut straight through his chest because his daughter had grown up here for 5 years while he slept in a mansion with bulletproof glass and heated floors. Camille opened the door after 3 knocks, eyes sharp with caution, an old nightgown hair loose. When she saw Ronan, she knew something was wrong because he wasn't the kind of man who showed up at midnight without a reason. Ronan told her directly about Johnny's call, about the threat, about Amelia being discovered. Camille's reaction wasn't fear, it was anger. The anger she'd held back for 6 years spilling into a low, sharp voice. This is exactly why I never wanted you to know. This is the world I tried to keep my daughter far away from, and now it's at my door. Ronan stood still and took it because she was right. Every word she said was right and he had nothing to defend himself with. I know, he said, but no matter how angry you are at me, Amelia needs protection now. Let me do that. Not because I deserve it, but because she deserves to be safe. Camille looked at him standing in the worn hallway of a building he'd never had to set foot in, and she understood that even if she wanted to slam the door in his face, the danger outside wouldn't vanish just because she wished it away. Amelia can't know, she said, her voice still hard, but shifting from anger into decision. Her life doesn't change on the surface. No bodyguards walking her into school, no armored cars, nothing that makes her scared. If you want to protect your daughter, do it in a way where she never feels like she needs protecting. Ronan nodded, then drove back to the Gold Coast and began dealing with Gianni the way his world dealt with threats. Yolna traced the money from the Volkov syndicate flowing to Gianni and cut it off by revealing to Vyulov that Gianni had misrepresented the value of his information to squeeze out more cash, turning him from an asset into a con man in the eyes of the very organization shielding him. At the same time, Ronan sent the Vyulov syndicate a clear message through an intermediary channel. Any move involving the Marchetti family would be treated as a declaration of war, and war with the Marchetti family was something no organization in Chicago could afford. Vyulov understood. Gianni lost protection, lost funding, lost every card he had left. And 2 weeks later, he left Chicago on a night bus heading west, disappearing from the city the way Camille had disappeared from the Gold Coast mansion 6 years earlier. Only this time, the difference was Camille had left with dignity, and Gianni left with empty hands and a name no one would claim. After the threat from Gianni was handled, the Saturday meetings at Millennium Park continued. Every week, Ronan arrived early. No suit, no bodyguards nearby. Even though now there were 2 men watching from a distance at his order, men Amelia would never know about. She grew used to Ronan's presence as a natural part of her weekend. She showed off her math scores, talked about the new picture she'd drawn at school, asked him everything from why tall buildings didn't fall over to why the Chicago sky was so often gray. Ronan answered every question with a patience that surprised even him because the world he lived in wasn't the kind of place that nurtured patience. Months passed and Camille watched from the side, not interfering, but always observing. She saw how Amelia began to look for Ronan more and more, how the child ran toward him the moment she spotted him on their familiar bench, how she started telling stories at home that began with Uncle Ronan said, and Camille knew the truth couldn't stay hidden any longer. Amelia deserved to know, and every day of delay was another day her daughter lived inside a half-truth. Camille chose a quiet Sunday afternoon. She invited Ronan to the apartment in Pilsen. The second time he climbed those red brick stairs, but this time not because of a threat, because of the opposite. Amelia was sitting on the old sofa drawing in her notebook when Ronan walked in. She lifted her head, smiled. Uncle Ronan then went back to drawing. Camille sat beside her. Ronan took the chair across from them. The living room was so small, the 3 of them were almost within touching distance, the ceiling fan turning slowly. Late afternoon light slipping through the window and landing on the old wooden floor. Camille placed her hand on Amelia's knee so the little girl would stop drawing and look up. Amelia, Mom needs to tell you something important. Amelia set the pencil down, looked at her mother, then at Ronan, then back at her mother. Those gray-green eyes serious beyond her age. Ronan isn't only Mom's friend, Camille said, her voice calm, though she had to grip Amelia's knee to keep it from trembling. He's your dad. Silence. Not the dramatic silence of a movie, but the silence of a 5-year-old processing something bigger than her understanding. Yet, with an instinct that grasped more than adults expected. Amelia didn't cry. She didn't shout. She didn't react wildly. She looked at Ronan for a long time, a very long time, with eyes just like his. Then asked in a small but clear voice, "Why wasn't Dad here from the beginning?" The question was simple, but it carried the weight of 5 Father's Days with no card to give. 5 years listening to friends talk about their dads while not knowing she had one. 5 years seeing the blank line on her birth certificate and never asking her mother why it was blank. Ronan didn't make excuses, didn't offer long explanations, didn't blame circumstances. "Because I was wrong," he said, voice low. Eyes holding steady on his daughter, and it took me a long time to understand. Amelia tilted her head, thinking the way she always did before she spoke, then asked one more question. "Do you understand now?" "I do," Ronan said. One word. And this time, he didn't need anything else because the 5-year-old in front of him didn't need complicated reasons. She only needed to know that now her father was here, and now her father understood. Amelia set the notebook aside, stood up from the sofa, took 2 small steps to Ronan and hugged him. The hug was brief, light, 2 tiny arms around the neck of a man she'd called uncle only months ago. But that hug had enough power to break 6 years of distance in a way no words ever could. Ronan hugged his daughter back, careful, gentle, as if he were holding the most precious thing he'd ever touched. Because he wasn't used to hugging anyone. His world didn't make room for tenderness. But when his daughter's arms tightened softly around his neck, a deeper instinct than any armor told him how to place a hand on her back and hold still. Camille sat on the sofa watching them. And when Amelia rested her cheek against Ronan's shoulder, Camille turned toward the window. Tears slid down her face. Not from sadness, not from fear, but from relief. Because she'd carried this secret alone for 6 years. And now it wasn't only on her shoulders anymore. Because her daughter finally knew she had a father. And the child didn't cry. She hugged, and sometimes the forgiveness of a 5-year-old is simpler and stronger than any courtroom in the world. In the weeks after that Sunday afternoon, the word Dad began to appear in Amelia's mouth like a small creature learning how to walk. The first time she said it was at the park.